Okay, so so we were talking about Mulberry versus Madison. You have John Adams, Federalist; Thomas Jefferson, Anti-Federalist; lame duck president. He wants to push through 16 judges on federal courts, not the Supreme Court, but federal courts. All right, so he pushes them through. The Senate confirms them, and then John Adams had a Secretary of State right here, and his name, I'm gonna put it under here. His Secretary of State's name was John Marshall. My nephew's name is John Marshall, so that's easy for me to remember. John Marshall. Incidentally, talking about Andrew Jackson, John Marshall was one of the people that he railed against on the Supreme Court, and he'd say, "You decided that. Let's see you enforce it." So that was John Marshall. Okay. So here we go. We have John Marshall, Secretary of State. Well, he forgot something. He forgot to commission these judges. Let's see what it says actually. Yeah, forgot to deliver the commission. So he would deliver them and say, okay, now you're a judge. They knew that they got nominated. They knew they got passed by the Senate, but why don't they have their commissions? Well, in the meantime, Thomas Jefferson takes office. It's in January, and all the Anti-Federalists are in power, and the new Secretary of State is James Madison. James Madison, I'm sure you're familiar with him. So James Madison has these commissions on his desk, like these are going. I'm not gonna deliver these commissions for all these judges. It would kind of be like Republicans getting in office and then pushing through all these very liberal, pro-abortion, pro-everything we're not pro judges pushing them through. Of course, you're not going to push them through. So he gets them. He says, I'm not dealing with those. I'm not even going to give them their commission. Well, one of the guys that was nominated, his name was Mulberry. And Mulberry went against our Secretary of State. This is kind of how I wrote my notes. I know I have to write notes so I can picture everything. But Mulberry went through our Secretary of State, James Madison, and he sued James Madison. And he said, no, these are my commissions. I should have them. Now, technically, what do I think? Probably, yeah, they probably should have had them. They were ratified by the Senate. I mean, if they wanted to do an amendment to kick them off or something or impeach them, if it went through the Senate, it did go through the process. But anyway, they went to court. Mulberry was one of the judges versus Madison, the new Secretary of State. Okay, that's what the course was about, or the court case was about. Well, in the meantime, I know this is confusing for you guys. In the meantime, this Secretary of State right here, John Marshall, that was under John Adams, he now was the Justice of the Supreme Court. So the guy that forgot to ratify the commissions is now on the Supreme Court, and he's hearing the case. Well, first of all, what is his party? What do you think other Federalists are thinking about him? Probably thinking, he's not too swift. We don't like him. He's probably in big trouble with his party. So he hears the case. Now, he should have excused himself, and he should have said, no, this has to deal with me, and I'm going to recuse myself. Recuse, R-E-C-U-S-E, just means I'm going to excuse myself and not be part of it because this has to deal with me. It's a conflict of interest, okay? But he didn't. So John Marshall on the Supreme Court voted that himself, when he was Secretary of State, who forgot to deliver the commissions, should have delivered them, and that they get their commissions. So that was a Supreme Court case called Mulberry versus Madison. Now, knowing everything I've told you so far about the presidents and how they didn't even pay attention, they said, well, that's the court's opinion. It says on the top line of all the Supreme Court cases, in the opinion of this court. So he said, well, if that's the court's opinion, fine. They never even abided by this. So John Adams and James Madison did not abide by the decision, and they really didn't pay the Supreme Court any mind. But this is the case that the Supreme Court goes back to now to say, oh, yes, we get to review the laws, and we get to review. In this case, they were reviewing the executive, executive powers. But No, you don't. They don't get to review the laws. They don't get to review what Congress does, and all. That's not in their purview. That's not one of the things that they're supposed to be doing. But because of this case that was ignored for years and years and years, that's one of the cases they cite. That's why it's so important, you guys. When we talk about precedent, setting precedent, that means a court case that other people can then cite their cases on. So it's very important setting a precedent. All right, Mulberry versus Madison is confusing, I know, but I think it's so interesting, and it's just important to know. Although my kids would tease me, you think it's interesting, Mom, because you're your age, but I do think it's interesting. So, when somebody wins by a landslide, it was clear that the people were saying, we don't want Federalists, and then we appointed all these new Federalists to the court, and really they can do so much damage when you have liberal people on the court. All right, Dred Scott decision. Talking about things that the Supreme Court did. When the Supreme Court issued the Dred Scott decision, it was ignored. It was ignored by Abraham Lincoln, of course. It had the Emancipation Proclamation and then later freed all the slaves. And the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all the slaves. I don't know if y'all knew that. It freed some of the slaves, but not all the slaves. But then after the war, of course, all the slaves were freed. Well, an interesting side note. In 1820, Congress actually eliminated slavery in certain territories. It was part of the Missouri Compromise. Well, 1820, slavery was eliminated. And that's why people were allowed to buy, they were allowed to own land. They were allowed to, black families were allowed to live and thrive, and some of them held office since 1820. So here, this is 37 years later. And then the Dred Scott decision comes. So again, Congress, who's supposed to be the lawmaking body, eliminated slavery in a lot of territories. They were trying to eliminate it all the way across, and that kind of leads into the Civil War. Why we had the Civil War? Because then all these new territories, all the new territories were not supposed to have slavery, and some of them said we want to have slavery, and it was just kind of this whole big thing. The Dred Scott decision too kind of pushed it over the edge. So 1820, 37 years later, the Dred Scott decision says, nope, black people are property, and that's it. They can't be free American people. And of course, that just caused chaos in the United States. So again, they were overturning something the legislature, who are nominated, voted on by the people, these 9 people on the court, and I don't even know how many was there then. It might have been 7 on the court. It might have been just 4 people overriding it, because there hasn't always been 9. It seems like it was 7 for a long time. And so 4 people is all it would take to say no to make the decision, because you can have a 4-3 decision, or now on our court we can have a 5-4 decision. So anyway, that's when Dred Scott came along, and Emancipation Proclamation basically was Abraham Lincoln saying, I'm not paying attention to you. So we have a long history in this country of not paying attention to the court. So we really don't have to pay attention. We really don't. And then, of course, we have the last case that we talked about, because I think we already talked about the Board of Education, is Roe v. Wade, of course. We hit again on Roe v. Wade, and I think I did it one of these parts too, where they said, no, that life inside you is not really a life, and a woman has a right to choose. And so Roe v. Wade was another huge case that had overreaching abilities. It was the federal government coming in and telling all the states, this is how it's going to be. And that would be Federalist or Democrat. Now it would be termed. Anti-Federalist Republicans some Republicans want big government too. We're supposed to be for smaller government. I'm conservative, smaller government. The smaller the better. We know what to do with our money better than other people know what to do with our money. And we don't need big government. All right, I think that's about everything we discussed in class. Let me look over and see if there's anything else. Charles Finney we talked about. He's the one that became a Christian, reading law books. I talked about the U.S. Capitol. All right, I think we talked about everything I absolutely wanted to talk about in my videos. I'm sorry it was so long. But there was some good information I wanted to get out. If you guys have any problems with any of your homework, let me know. I'll be glad to help you. Okay? Have a great week.